In the summer of 1866, the town of Sedalia, Missouri, found itself in the grip of an unspeakable mystery. Timothy Caldwell, a boy no older than 8, stepped into the world of a quiet farming community. On the surface, he appeared no different from any other child, but his presence seemed to unsettle those who crossed his path. With pale blue eyes that felt far too old for his age, and an unnerving calmness in his every move, it was as if he was studying everything, including the people around him. Timothy's entrance wasn't marked by violence, but a haunting stillness. Carried with him only a small cloth bag, a reminder of his tragic past. The death of his parents and the brutal toll of the Civil War. To most, this child was simply another orphan, brought in by his uncle, Thomas Caldwell, to help with the struggles of farm life. But what the community didn't know was that Timothy had something far darker, buried beneath his innocent appearance. His politeness, his unquestioning obedience, all hid a growing shadow. And over time, that shadow would consume the very people who trusted him. But before we descend deeper into the unsettling tale of Timothy Caldwell and the unimaginable horrors that followed, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This is a story that goes far beyond the realm of ordinary mystery. You're about to uncover truths about this boy that will make your blood run cold. Now, let's begin with the first chilling chapter in the life of Timothy Caldwell, the boy who was far more than a tragic orphan, the boy whose every smile was a mask. By the fall of 1866, Sedalia had begun to whisper about the boy with the pale eyes. Timothy's life on the Caldwell farm seemed uneventful at first. Working the land, assisting with chores, never a moment of play, was the picture of a well-behaved child. But the unsettling silence he carried with him was growing impossible to ignore. He wasn't like the other kids. He never ran, never laughed, never looked for friends. Instead, he was always alone, focused, and unbothered by the childish distractions that filled the days of others. It wasn't long before the town faced its first tragedy. On a hot August afternoon, a small girl named Mary Fletcher, the daughter of the town's blacksmith, went missing near Willow Creek. Timothy was the one who found her. When he appeared at her family's doorstep, his clothes damp and his face unusually pale, he brought with him the devastating news. Mary was dead, her small body discovered face down in the shallow water. It seemed like a simple accident, a child drowning in a creek, but there was something about the way Timothy spoke about the event that struck people as strange. He detailed the exact position of Mary's body, the placement of her limbs, the way her dress had gotten caught on a submerged branch. He even described the color of the water around her face. This wasn't normal for a child who had just discovered a tragic death. The level of detail seemed almost rehearsed. His recall was precise, far too precise for someone who should have been overwhelmed with emotion. Dr. Samuel Harding, the local physician who had witnessed the toll war had taken on the community, found himself deeply disturbed by the boy's calmness. Harding had examined many soldiers who had endured unimaginable horrors. Never had he encountered a child like this. The boy who calmly recounted a death with such chilling accuracy. Timothy claimed to have found Mary while searching for a lost calf, but the calf was found days later, miles from where Timothy had described the discovery. At Mary's funeral, Timothy sat motionless. His eyes, cold and calculating, watched the grieving family without a single tear. He bowed his head, like the others, but his expression remained void of sorrow. The community was starting to wonder if something far more sinister lay beneath the surface of this well-behaved boy. The second death came swiftly, and with it, the weight of suspicion began to settle upon the Caldwell farm like a dark cloud that refused to lift. Timothy Caldwell, still only 8 years old, was seen more and more as a figure of fascination and fear. The town had accepted his presence with a hesitant warmth, a kind orphan trying to fill the empty spaces left by the war. But with each passing day, whispers grew. It wasn't just the boy's disturbing calmness or his uncanny knowledge of things no child should know. It was the incidents that followed him. The animals, the unexplained deaths, the strange occurrences that seemed to have one common denominator: Timothy. Old Henrik Len, a Norwegian immigrant known for his quiet life and his deep knowledge of the land, was found dead at the bottom of a bluff known locally as Devil's Bluff. The elderly man had been known to climb the rocky outcrop regularly to check on wild beehives, but on this day, he had not returned. His body was discovered, neck broken, the result of what appeared to be a fall from the top of the 40-foot cliff. When Timothy was asked to explain his presence at the scene, calmly recounted how he had called out to Henrik, seen his hat caught in the thorn bushes, and then climbed down to discover his body. Dr. Harding, called to the scene, examined the body and found something that didn't sit right with him. Scattered bees around Henrik's body. This was odd, as the old man had been careful not to disturb the hives. The bees had been clustered around the impact site as if they had been guided there. It didn't make sense. Dr. Harding questioned Timothy further. The boy offered a simple explanation, jesting that Henrik had disturbed the bees, causing them to attack and disorient him, leading to his fatal fall. But Harding couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. There was no evidence of agitation at the hives, and the boy's story seemed too neat, too perfect. The town's unease deepened with the third incident. 6-year-old Jacob Mills disappeared while playing in the woods, only to be found 4 days later, trapped in an abandoned well. Timothy, as always, had volunteered to join the search, his persistence and knowledge of the land impressing the search party. He was the one who found the boy, leading the searchers directly to the well. Jacob was pulled from the well, but by then it was too late. He died from dehydration and exposure hours later, and once again, Timothy's involvement raised more questions than answers. His behavior, when Jacob passed away, was eerily detached. As the boy faded, Timothy didn't show the expected grief. Instead, seemed to catalog every moment, his eyes never leaving the dying child. What was happening here? Was this just a series of tragic accidents, or was something darker at play? At Harding began to suspect the unimaginable. That this child, this innocent-looking boy, was somehow at the heart of it all, and what terrified him most was the possibility that Timothy might not be acting out of malice, but out of something far more dangerous. A cold, clinical curiosity about death. As the seasons changed, so did the town's perception of Timothy Caldwell. What had once been whispers became open suspicion. Dr. Samuel Harding, the town's physician, and the man most familiar with the boy's unsettling behavior, couldn't shake the feeling that there was something far more dangerous beneath the surface. Timothy's continued involvement in the death surround the farm could no longer be chalked up to coincidence. The boy was always present, always in the right place at the right time, and yet always so calm, almost too calm. And as much as Dr. Harding wanted to dismiss his growing concerns, evidence was beginning to mount. Livestock deaths, small and large animals found dead with precise injuries. Their necks broken, their bodies maimed in ways that made no sense. Foxes, the natural predators of the land, were blamed by many, but there was never a trace of foxes near the bodies. It wasn't just the animals, though. People had begun to die under strange circumstances. Accidents that seemed to follow in Timothy's wake. Mrs. Elenina Patterson, a neighbor whose farm bordered the Caldwell property, had noticed her chickens behaving oddly whenever Timothy was near. They would cluster together in fear, refusing to wander near the fence line, separating their land from the Caldwell farm. It was an instinctive animal reaction, a warning that something was wrong. But the townspeople were too kind-hearted, too trusting of the boy's polite manners and quiet demeanor to make the connection. Still, the deaths continued, and with each one, Dr. Harding grew more convinced that something more sinister was happening. It wasn't until late autumn, when Thomas Caldwell injured his back during harvest, that Dr. Harding was finally given access to Timothy on a regular basis. The boy's behavior became more erratic, more disturbing. When Harding visited the Caldwell farm under the guise of treating Thomas, he began to observe Timothy more closely. The boy was always present, watching the doctor work. But there was something else, something more unsettling, that Dr. Harding began to notice. Timothy asked questions that seemed too mature for a child his age. He asked about the mechanics of death, the signs of trauma, the way the human body reacts to injury and suffering. It was the kind of curiosity that no child should possess. At first, Dr. Harding tried to brush it off as simple childhood curiosity. But the more he engaged with the boy, the more his gut told him that this was not normal. One day, after a particularly disturbing line of questioning, Harding asked Timothy why he seemed so interested in death. Timothy's answer, given with the same calm politeness that defined his character, sent a chill down the doctor's spine. "I want to understand," the boy had said. "I want to understand what happens when someone who trusts you completely, someone who believes in you, is hurt. I want to know how they react." It was then that Dr. Harding realized that this child, this innocent-looking boy who sat so quietly in the corner of every room, wasn't just studying death. He was planning it. The experiments Timothy had conducted on animals, and now on humans, were not accidents. They were deliberate, calculated, and terrifying. What had started as innocent curiosity had evolved into something far darker, something that Dr. Harding could no longer ignore. The true horror of Timothy Caldwell was beginning to reveal itself, and it was far more chilling than anyone had ever anticipated. Dr. Samuel Harding had been trained to face horrors. He had seen soldiers maimed and broken, witnessed the pain and suffering of war, and yet nothing in his medical career had prepared him for the cold, calculated nature of Timothy Caldwell. It was no longer a matter of suspicion. The boy was dangerous. There was no other way to interpret the chilling discoveries Harding was now making. Over several weeks, he gathered more evidence of Timothy's experiments. What had once been a series of odd behaviors now appeared to be part of a deliberate, methodical pattern. Timothy's interest in anatomy, death, and suffering wasn't innocent curiosity. It was scientific, clinical. And as Harding delved deeper into the mystery, he realized that the boy's studies went far beyond animals. Timothy had been experimenting on humans. When Dr. Harding investigated the caves near the Caldwell farm, a discovery that would haunt him forever was made. Hidden beneath the earth, Timothy had set up a small, disturbing workshop. It was here, among crude tools and broken bones, that he had carried out his experiments. The walls of the cave were covered in drawings, sketches rendered with an unsettling precision. Animals were the first subjects of his cruel studies, but soon the drawings took on a more horrifying nature. There were sketches of people, children, adults, in various stages of suffering, their bodies contorted in agony. Each drawing was meticulously detailed, accompanied by notes on the reactions of the subjects, the time it took for them to die, and the methods used to cause them harm. It was the kind of documentation that a trained surgeon might compile. But instead of life-saving knowledge, it was the study of death itself. One of the drawings depicted Mary Fletcher, the first child to die near the creek. Another showed Henrik Len, the elderly man who had fallen to his death. And then there was a drawing of Jacob Mills, the young boy who had been trapped in the well, body slowly succumbing to the effects of dehydration. The truth was undeniable now. Timothy Caldwell had not just been an observer. He had been an orchestrator, a master of death, pulling the strings of the community's demise. But what was even more chilling was the realization that he wasn't done. There were newer sketches, drawings that depicted even darker scenarios, suggesting that Timothy was planning to experiment on someone else, someone close. And it wasn't just the drawings that filled Harding with dread. The notes, the meticulous records of Timothy's observations, all pointed to one thing: a deep, unsettling understanding of human behavior. Timothy's ability to predict how people would react to his actions, how he would orchestrate their deaths, was not something born out of chance. No, this boy was learning. He was evolving. And the more Dr. Harding uncovered, the clearer it became. Timothy wasn't just a boy who had witnessed death, he was someone who had mastered it. Dr. Harding, now aware that he was dealing with something far beyond a mere child, began to consider his next steps carefully. But the problem was, what could he do? The town would never believe him. No one would ever accept the idea that an innocent, looking 8-year-old could be the mastermind behind such unspeakable horrors. What Timothy Caldwell had done was beyond the realm of understanding. And yet it was real. And it was happening in Sedalia. The town had no idea what it was about to face. The more Dr. Harding uncovered, the more a horrifying truth became undeniable. The boy had crossed the line from innocent curiosity to deliberate cruelty. Timothy Caldwell wasn't just a byproduct of a broken home or a troubled childhood. He was something else entirely. Something more dangerous. And as Harding pieced together the puzzle of the boy's past and present, the implications were far more disturbing than any of them had realized. The small, methodical steps he had taken, from the animal mutilations to the eerie sketches of human suffering, pointed to one clear fact. Timothy had been planning these deaths, orchestrating them like a sick game of science and control. He wasn't just an observer of death, he was a creator, manipulating the lives of those around him with cold precision. Now, Dr. Harding found himself facing a dilemma. He had all the evidence. The cave full of drawings, the meticulously kept notes, the pattern of deaths that seemed to follow Timothy like a shadow. But what could he do with it? Could he go to the authorities with this? Tell them about the boy who had, with his own hands, caused the deaths of so many? Would anyone believe him, or would they dismiss it as the ramblings of a doctor who had seen too much in his lifetime? There was no precedent for what Timothy was capable of, no scientific or psychological framework that could explain what was happening. And as Harding sat there, torn between the duty to protect the community and the overwhelming fear of what Timothy might do next, he realized that time was running out. The boy's behavior had escalated. Timothy had already shown an alarming ability to manipulate those around him. He had played his part perfectly, never once revealing his true nature to anyone. And now, Harding was beginning to realize just how deeply the boy's grip had reached into the fabric of the town. He had already gotten away with so much. What would happen when he realized that Dr. Harding was the only one who had the power to stop him? And then, just as Harding began to consider his next move, it happened. Timothy, as always, appeared at the most opportune time. He was standing at the threshold of the doctor's office, staring with those unblinking, calculating eyes, as if he had been waiting. Harding couldn't help but feel a cold shiver race down his spine. Timothy was always there, always watching, always waiting. The boy spoke, his voice as calm and detached as ever, but with a clear undertone of something darker. "You know what I've been doing," Timothy said, his words cutting through the thick silence. "You know what I'm capable of." There was no fear in his tone, no plea for mercy. Just a cold recognition of the truth. Harding's blood ran cold as the weight of the boy's words hit him. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to understand," Timothy replied, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I want you to understand what happens when someone like me gets to know too much." There was a pause. Then Timothy took a step closer, his gaze locked onto Harding's with an intensity that felt like a physical blow. "And I want you to know," Timothy continued, his voice now almost hypnotic, "that there's nothing you can do to stop it, because I always know what's going to happen next." The boy was no longer a mystery to Dr. Harding. He was a threat. And yet, there was something more terrifying in Timothy's words. He was also a predator, and now he had set his sights on Dr. Harding as the next victim in his twisted game. The realization hit Harding hard. This was no longer a case of innocent death or unexplained accidents. Timothy Caldwell was a force of nature, a force that could not be reasoned with, not understood, and certainly not stopped. Harding had just become part of the experiment. As Harding grappled with the chilling reality of Timothy Caldwell's nature, he realized that the boy had no intention of stopping. The deaths, the manipulation, the cold, calculating detachment, they were all part of a much bigger plan. A plan that included everyone in the town of Sedalia. The community that had embraced this child as an orphan, as someone who needed care, was now the very target of his cruel, twisted game. And Dr. Harding had become a key player in that game, whether he liked it or not. Timothy had made it clear. He knew Harding's every move, his every thought. The boy had been studying him, just as he had studied his other victims. He had been preparing for this moment, just as he had prepared for the deaths of the others. The realization that he was now a part of Timothy's design was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was one Harding could no longer avoid. He had to act. The question was how. The authorities would never believe him. No one would. No one would understand that a child, an innocent, looking polite, and well-mannered boy, could be capable of such horrors. How could they? There were no precedents for this. No framework for understanding what Timothy Caldwell had become. Dr. Harding had spent countless hours in medical schools and battlefield hospitals, learning to heal the wounded, to save lives. But he had never been taught how to deal with a child like Timothy. A child who studied death, who dissected it like a scientist in a lab, who seemed to manipulate fate itself with cold precision. Harding knew the town would never accept what he had uncovered, and the boy's power was growing. Timothy's plan was far more insidious than simply killing. No, it wasn't just death Timothy sought. It was control. It was power. and it was something that Harding couldn't allow to continue. He had to stop the boy before it was too late, before Timothy expanded his reach even further. But how could he stop a child who was so methodical, so intelligent, so utterly devoid of human empathy? Every plan Harding devised seemed doomed to failure before it even began. He had tried to warn the sheriff, but the evidence was circumstantial at best. A few drawings, some suspicious deaths, a town full of people who couldn't accept that a child might be the source of their suffering. Timothy Caldwell was not just a murderer. He was a predator, hunting in plain sight, masked by the innocence of a child. And now, Harding was trapped in this web, a pawn in a game that he didn't understand and couldn't escape. The clock was ticking. Each second that passed brought more danger to the town. Each moment Timothy's presence lingered pushed the community closer to collapse. There was only one thing left to do. Harding had to confront Timothy head-on, without the support of anyone else. He had to face the boy, look into those unblinking eyes, and somehow stop the madness before it consumed them all. The confrontation between Dr. Harding and Timothy Caldwell was inevitable. There was no longer any other option. The boy, with his chilling calmness, already begun to manipulate everyone around him. No one was safe. Timothy had proven that his intellect was a weapon, a tool that could be used to ensnare and destroy anyone in his path. Harding knew this better than anyone, and as he approached the Caldwell farm that fateful morning, he realized that he was walking into the lion's den. The air was thick with tension, kind of stillness that precedes a storm. The farm, once bustling with activity, now stood silent. The usual sounds of livestock were absent. The chickens didn't cluck, the pigs didn't grunt. There was only a deep, unsettling quiet. As Harding approached the front door, Timothy appeared as though he had been waiting. His pale blue eyes locked onto the doctor's with unnerving focus, as if he knew exactly what was going to happen next. "Good morning, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his voice as polite and composed as ever, but there was something different in his tone now. An almost predatory excitement that Harding couldn't ignore. Timothy wasn't afraid. He wasn't nervous. He was ready. "I've been waiting for you," the boy continued, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of warmth or gratitude, but one of cold calculation, as if Timothy knew that this moment of reckoning, had been carefully orchestrated long ago. The boy had been anticipating this. Harding's heart raced, his pulse quickened. This was no longer just a medical examination. This wasn't even about Timothy's death toll. This was the final chapter in a game that the boy had been playing with deadly precision. Timothy had been preparing for this day, just as Dr. Harding had. But it wasn't just a test of intellect or willpower. It was a battle for control. A battle that Harding could not afford to lose. "I know what you've been doing," Dr. Harding said, his voice steady despite the panic rising within him. "I know everything. The deaths, the experiments, the manipulation. It ends today." Timothy tilted his head slightly, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling mixture of curiosity and amusement. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice light, almost casual. "You think you're the first person to try?" Harding didn't flinch. He knew what Timothy was capable of. He knew how dangerous the boy truly was. But this was no longer a fight for survival. This was a fight to protect the community, to protect the future. And Harding had come too far to let Timothy's reign of terror continue. "I have to stop you," Harding said, his voice firm. "You've already taken enough lives. The town will never recover if I let you go on." For the first time, Timothy's expression shifted. It wasn't fear or anger, but something else. Something almost disappointed. "You're wasting your time," Timothy said softly. "You think you understand me, but you don't. You never will. I'm not like everyone else. I'm different." And that was the truth, wasn't it? Timothy Caldwell wasn't like everyone else. He was a force of nature, a predator cloaked in the innocence of a child. And for the first time, Harding realized that this boy was something beyond comprehension. Something that couldn't be stopped with logic or reason. Timothy had already won. And now, Dr. Harding was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss. The final game had begun, and only one could walk away. Dr. Harding could feel the walls closing in. The tension in the air was thick, oppressive, as Timothy Caldwell's eyes pierced into him with a chilling intensity. It was as if the boy had seen through every layer of Harding's soul, stripping away his resolve with nothing more than a look. Timothy's gaze, cold and calculating, seemed to mock the very notion that anyone could stop him. He had planned everything. Every move, every death, every whispered moment of fear. Dr. Harding's breath caught in his throat as Timothy spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "You don't understand, do you?" Timothy said softly, his voice dripping with a calm certainty that sent shivers down Harding's spine. "I'm not some child who doesn't know what he's doing. I've studied everything. I've watched. I've learned. And now I'm ready." The boy's words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, just a quiet, unsettling confidence that chilled Dr. Harding to the core. Timothy had already decided. There was no question. This was his game, and everyone else was simply a piece on the board. Harding, once again, felt the crushing weight of his helplessness. He knew that confronting Timothy head-on was the only option, but even as the boy's words cut through him, Harding could sense the futility of it all. The town had been blind to the danger for so long. Even now, as the doctor faced down the child responsible for the deaths, no one would believe the truth. How could they? The world didn't work this way. Children didn't orchestrate death. Children didn't plan murder with the precision of a surgeon. But Timothy Caldwell had shattered every preconceived notion about innocence. He had turned the idea of childhood into something dark, something twisted, something that no one could comprehend. As Dr. Harding looked at the boy standing before him, the weight of the truth settled on his shoulders like a death sentence. This wasn't about saving the town anymore. This wasn't about stopping the madness. It was too late for that. The only thing left was survival. His own survival. Timothy had already proven that he could manipulate everything, control everyone, including the doctor. With every interaction, with every move he made, the boy had shown an understanding of human nature that went beyond mere intelligence. He knew how to get under people's skin, how to pull the strings of their deepest fears and desires. Harding had underestimated him. And now he was caught in the trap. "You think you can control this, but you can't," Harding said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. "You're just a boy, Timothy. You've been playing a game you don't understand." Timothy smiled, the expression not one of warmth, but of quiet satisfaction. "I understand more than you think, Dr. Harding. I know exactly what I'm doing." The finality of Timothy's words hit like a punch to the gut. Dr. Harding had been searching for a way to stop him, but he realized, with a sickening clarity, that it was already over. Timothy had already won, and now There was nothing left but the aftermath. The boy had come for the town, for the world. And in the end was the doctor who had become the pawn in his game. As Harding stood there, paralyzed by the reality of the situation, he understood one terrifying fact. Timothy Caldwell was not just a murderer, he was something far more dangerous. He was a force of nature, and there was no escaping it. The silence that fell over the room was suffocating. Dr. Harding stood frozen, staring at Timothy Caldwell, who now appeared more like a predator than a child. The air was thick with the weight of inevitability, the feeling that all attempts to stop this nightmare had already failed. Timothy had already laid his plans. He had already orchestrated his moves with such precision that Harding felt powerless in his presence. The boy had manipulated everything, from the deaths of the animals to the destruction of families. Every moment had been a calculated move in a twisted game, and Dr. Harding had been a player trapped in the web Timothy had spun. Harding's mind raced, searching for some solution, some way out of this nightmare. But the truth was undeniable. There was no escape. The boy had already seen through every defense, anticipated every action. Timothy knew Harding's every thought, every hesitation. He was playing him, and playing him well. Timothy took a step closer, his pale blue eyes locking onto Harding's, his gaze unyielding. "You know, Dr. Harding," he said softly, words almost a whisper. "You were always so interested in the nature of death, in how people react to pain, to suffering. Well, now you get to experience it firsthand." Harding could feel the cold sweat trickle down his spine. The boy's words were calm, but there was an underlying threat in every syllable. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was the final test. Timothy had taken control of everything, and now he was about to show the doctor exactly what he was capable of. Harding's breath caught in his throat as the boy slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, shiny object. A knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. "This is the part I've been waiting for," Timothy continued, his voice as cool as ever. "You'll finally understand what it feels like to be in control, to be the one who decides who lives and who dies." Dr. Harding's heart pounded in his chest, his mind scrambling for a plan, for a way to stop Timothy before it was too late. But deep down, knew it was already over. Timothy had already anticipated his every move. The boy was not just a killer, he was a master of manipulation, a mind so sharp that it cut through every defense Harding tried to put up. And now, as the blade gleamed in Timothy's hand, Harding knew that he was facing something far more dangerous than a murderer. He was facing a child who had learned how to play the game of life and death with terrifying precision. In that moment, everything Dr. Harding had once believed about innocence, about childhood, shattered. The child standing before him was not a victim of circumstance. He wasn't a product of his upbringing or his past. Timothy Caldwell was a force of nature, a dark intelligence that had no place in the world. He had learned everything, and now he was ready to teach his final lesson. The game was over, and Dr. Harding was the last player standing, with nowhere to run. The cold, gleaming knife in Timothy Caldwell's hand reflected the dim light of the room, its presence so small, so innocuous, yet so filled with purpose. Duck. Harding felt the weight of it settle into his chest like a stone. There were no words left to be said. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and there was nothing to stop it now. The boy's eyes, wide and unblinking, held an intensity that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Timothy had already proven his control over the situation. He was playing a game, and Harding had no choice but to follow his lead. But then, just as Harding braced himself for the inevitable, something changed. The air around them seemed to thicken, as if the universe itself had decided to intervene. Timothy, still holding the knife, paused. The boy's gaze shifted, his focus breaking momentarily, as though he had been distracted by something that only he could perceive. Dr. Harding didn't know what to make of it. Was it fear? Doubt? Or was it just another layer of manipulation? But before he could contemplate further, Timothy spoke. "You know?" The boy said slowly, his voice taking on an odd, contemplative tone. "I used to think I had everything figured out. I used to think I knew exactly how all of this would play out. I thought I was in control." His words hung in the air like a riddle, impossible to decipher. Dr. Harding didn't know what to do. Knife still gleamed in Timothy's hand, but the boy's gaze had softened, almost as if he were questioning his own actions. For a fleeting moment, Timothy's expression flickered with something that almost resembled doubt. "But now," Timothy continued, his voice quieter now, "I realized something." Harding was caught in the whirlwind of uncertainty, his instincts urging him to act, to run, to escape the boy's grasp. But he couldn't move. Not yet. Not when Timothy was speaking with such calm authority. "I don't know what happens next," Timothy said, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that had never been there before. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all this power. It's all just too much." The words were a jarring contradiction to the monster Dr. Harding had come to understand Timothy to be. The boy, the predator, the manipulator. Now speaking with uncertainty, Harding's mind raced. Was this a trick? A new level of manipulation? Or was it something more? Could this be the moment where the power dynamic shifted, where the game that Timothy had so carefully constructed began to unravel? "I don't know what happens next," Timothy repeated, this time more to himself than to the doctor. His grip on the knife loosened just slightly. It was as if, for the briefest of moments, the boy was questioning the very nature of his existence. Harding's heart pounded in his chest. Was this his opportunity? Could Timothy's own inner conflict be the crack he needed to exploit? "Timothy," Harding said, his voice low and measured, "this is your chance. You can still stop. You don't have to do this." But as soon as the words left his mouth, Timothy's face snapped back into focus, his eyes narrowing with an intensity that made Harding's blood run cold. "Stop," Timothy repeated, his voice a dangerous whisper. "No. I've come too far to stop now. There's no turning back." The boy's grip on the knife tightened, and with that, any fleeting hope of a momentary change in Timothy's demeanor vanished. Dr. Harding had miscalculated. Timothy wasn't vulnerable. He wasn't lost. He was simply evolving, taking the next step in his twisted journey toward power and control. The game was not over. It was only just beginning. Timothy's eyes burned with a dangerous intensity, and his grip on the knife tightened. The fleeting vulnerability, the moment of self-doubt, had vanished in an instant. It was as if a mask had been dropped, and the true monster was revealed once more. The boy was no longer questioning his actions, wasn't lost, conflicted, or seeking redemption. He had already made his choice, and that choice was to continue on his path, a path paved with death, manipulation, and control. Harding's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, facing a boy who was more than just a child. Timothy wasn't the innocent orphan the town had believed him to be. He wasn't the scared, broken child of war who had lost everything. No, Timothy Caldwell was a predator, a force that would stop at nothing to claim dominion over those around him. And in that moment, Harding realized that there was no reasoning with this child. There was no way to save him, no way to turn him back from the abyss he had willingly walked into. Timothy had long since abandoned any notions of innocence. He had chosen to become something darker, something far more dangerous. Dr. Harding's mind raced, searching for a way out. But with each passing second, the reality of the situation became clearer. There was no escape from the web Timothy had woven. The boy had already pulled the strings, set the stage. And now there was no way to undo the damage. "You think you can stop me?" Timothy whispered, his voice low and cold, his eyes never leaving the doctor's. "You think you can just walk in here and change everything? You can't. This is who I am. This is what I was made for." There was no hint of fear, no remorse, no hesitation. It was as if Timothy had accepted his dark role in the world, as though the power he wielded over others had become his sole purpose. And in his eyes, there was something far more terrifying than the knife in his hand. It was the complete lack of emotion, the total absence of empathy. Dr. Harding realized that he was no longer just facing a child who had committed horrific acts. He was facing a creature who had embraced his capacity for destruction, who had learned how to use it with terrifying precision. Timothy was no longer a mere boy. He was a force of nature, an unstoppable force who had no regard for human life, no understanding of morality, no comprehension of the consequences of his actions. "I don't need to explain myself to you," Timothy continued, his voice cutting through the silence. "I'm not like the others. I'm different. I was always different. And now, you'll understand what happens when someone like me gets exactly what he wants." The finality in Timothy's words struck Dr. Harding like a punch to the gut. The doctor had spent his life trying to heal the broken, to understand the complexities of human suffering. But Timothy Caldwell was beyond understanding. He was a force that had transcended human limits, a force that could not be reasoned with or stopped. In that moment, Dr. Harding knew one thing for certain. Timothy was not a victim of his circumstances. He was the embodiment of darkness itself, and he was not going to stop until he had claimed everything in his path. The chilling realization hit Harding harder than anything else. There was no one left to save. There was only one choice left, and it was no longer a question of saving anyone. It was a question of surviving. The room felt like it was closing in, the air thick with tension. Timothy stood before Dr. Harding, knife in hand, his gaze unwavering. The calmness in his eyes was more unsettling than the gleaming blade he held. There was no fear in this boy, no hesitation. There was only a cold, calculating certainty that twisted Harding's insides. This wasn't just a child holding a weapon. This was a predator, one who had studied the art of control, of suffering, and of death. Timothy had already made his choice. The question now was whether Harding could make his own, or whether he would be consumed by this nightmare. Dr. Harding's mind raced, searching desperately for a way to stop this. He had to act. He had to find a way to break the boy's hold, to expose the truth to the world. But in that moment, as he stared into the cold, emotionless eyes of Timothy Caldwell, he realized something terrifying. Timothy didn't need to convince anyone. He didn't need to explain himself. He was the truth, the force that no one could fight. The boy had already proven that. Every death, every experiment, every subtle manipulation of the people around him had been part of a plan that no one had seen coming. And now, Timothy was ready to bring the game to its final conclusion. Harding's pulse quickened as the reality of the situation sank in. There was no turning back. This wasn't just about saving the town anymore. It wasn't even about stopping the boy. This was about survival, about getting out alive. And as much as Harding hated to admit it, he knew that he was no longer in control. Timothy was. There was a flicker of movement. Timothy stepped forward, the knife glinting in the low light. "You should have understood by now," the boy said, his voice almost gentle, yet laced with menace. "You were never going to stop me. No one was." Harding swallowed hard, his mind spinning. His options were dwindling with every passing second. But there had to be something he could do. He wasn't the type to give up, not when so much was at stake. He had to think. He had to act. But the boy before him was so much more than anyone could have predicted. His cold detachment, his uncanny intelligence, the way he had manipulated everything. It was too much. Timothy wasn't just a child who had learned to kill. He was a reflection of something darker, something broken inside humanity. A force that had no place in the world. The boy's expression softened ever so slightly, the edge of the knife catching the light once more. "You're scared," Timothy said, as if reading Harding's mind. "You're scared of what comes next. But you don't need to be." Harding's heart raced. What did the boy mean? Was this part of his game? Was this another trap? Timothy's next words sent a chill down Harding's spine. "You'll see. This isn't just about me anymore. It's about what happens when someone like me gets everything he wants. It's about the power that no one can stop." The implication of those words was enough to freeze Harding in place. Timothy wasn't just a killer. He wasn't just a child consumed by darkness. He was a force of nature. And now, he was ready to unleash the full extent of that power. There was no way out. No escape. No salvation. The game was over, and Dr. Harding was the last man standing, facing a force he couldn't comprehend. A force that had already won. The tension between Dr. Harding and Timothy Caldwell was now palpable, a silent battle of wills unfolding in the dim room. Harding could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This was it. This was the culmination of everything. The boy, standing there with that knife, was not just a killer. He was an embodiment of something far darker, a twisted reflection of human nature itself. Harding knew he couldn't stop Timothy with force, not when the boy was so far ahead, so far beyond the capacity of anyone else to comprehend. Every instinct in Harding screamed to flee, to escape the boy's chilling grasp. But there was nowhere to run. This was the moment when everything would be decided. "You still don't get it, do you?" Timothy spoke again, his voice low, but carrying an air of complete certainty. "You still think you can control this, that you can change things. But you can't. No one can." Harding's hands clenched, his mind desperately searching for any shred of hope. "What do you want, Timothy?" Harding asked, trying to steady his breath, his heart hammering in his chest. Timothy smiled, and it wasn't a smile of joy, but of sheer calculation. "I want you to understand," he said. "I want you to understand what happens when someone like me gets everything he wants. When someone finally has the power to shape things, to make things happen. It's not about killing people, it's about control, power. It's about knowing that nothing, no one, can stop you." Harding's blood ran cold. He had thought the boy's actions were driven by mindless violence, a child's broken understanding of the world. But now it was clear. This wasn't about chaos. This wasn't about random death. This was about domination, about bending everything and everyone to his will. Timothy had become a master manipulator, an intellect so sharp and devoid of empathy that it cut through the very fabric of humanity. The realization hit Harding like a freight train. It wasn't just that Timothy killed. It was that he was controlling everything around him, calculating every death, every tragedy. He wasn't just a killer. He was the puppeteer. He had orchestrated everything, pulling the strings, making every death appear like an accident, a coincidence till the entire town was ensnared in his web. And are you? You're not like the others. Timothy continued, taking a step closer, the knife still gleaming in his hand. You've seen it. You've understood it. You know what I am. Harding's mind raced as he fought to keep his composure. He couldn't afford to show weakness, to give Timothy the satisfaction of knowing that the doctor was shaken. But it was hard. It was so hard to face the full extent of what Timothy had become. This is where it ends, Timothy, Harding said, his voice firm despite the turmoil inside him. It's over. Timothy tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged, unreadable. You really think it's over? He asked softly, almost with a hint of amusement. This isn't just about me, Dr. Harding. It's about what I represent, what I've learned, what I've become, and no one can stop that. Harding's blood ran cold once again as the full weight of the boy's words settled on him. Timothy wasn't just a child who had gone wrong. He was the culmination of something much more dangerous. A force that couldn't be stopped, a creature that could manipulate not just people, but the very reality around him. There was no salvation, no hope, no turning back. The room was silent now, save for the steady rhythm of Dr. Harding's breath, the tension so thick it seemed to suffocate the air itself. Timothy Caldwell, standing in front of him, was no longer the child he had once appeared to be. There was no innocence in those pale blue eyes, no trace of vulnerability or fear. What stood before Dr. Harding was not a boy, but a predator. A being so consumed by power and control that it felt like staring into the abyss itself. Timothy had no need for weapons anymore. His words, his very presence, were his tools. He had already won. The knife was just a symbol now, a mere formality. Harding felt the crushing weight of truth settle upon him. Timothy wasn't just playing a game. He wasn't just causing death, he was changing the rules. The boy had manipulated everyone. The community, the authorities, the people who trusted him. Every action, every move he made had been deliberate, each step leading to this moment, a moment where no one could stop him. Not Dr. Harding, not anyone. The boy's lips curled into a cold, almost absent smile, as if he was enjoying the full weight of his power. You're still thinking, aren't you? Timothy said, his voice soft, almost teasing. You're still wondering if there's a way out, if you can stop me. But you can't. Harding stood frozen, knife gleamed in the boy's hand. But the true weapon was not in the blade. It was in the boy's mind, in his ability to control, to manipulate, to twist every situation to his advantage. This wasn't just a child. This was a force of nature. Unstoppable, calculating, beyond anything Harding had ever faced. You think I'm just a child, Timothy continued, his tone growing colder. But you're wrong. I've learned things you could never understand. Things that make me stronger than anyone. And now I'm going to show you what happens when I'm in control. Harding's heart pounded in his chest. There was no way out. There was no one coming to save him, no authority to rely on. The town was already lost, caught in Timothy's web. This wasn't just about stopping a killer. It was about stopping a force that had already consumed everything around him. The boy wasn't the exception. He was the culmination of something darker, something that had been growing for years. Timothy had made his choice long ago. And now, Harding was standing in the final moments of that decision, caught in the wake of the boy's unrelenting ambition. "You've seen what I can do," Timothy whispered, his eyes never leaving Harding's. "No, you'll see what happens when someone like me decides the game is over." Harding's blood ran cold. He was standing on the edge of an abyss. Timothy had already won. The power the boy wielded was absolute. There was no running, no fighting. There was only the inevitable end. And as Harding looked into Timothy's eyes, he realized the horrifying truth. It wasn't just that Timothy would win, it was that he had already won. The boy had already rewritten the rules of this game, and now the world would have to live with the consequences. Dr. Harding stood frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the boy in front of him. The weight of the knife in Timothy's hand felt like a symbol of everything that had gone wrong in this world. But it wasn't the blade that terrified him. It was the boy's mind. That cold, calculating, and utterly emotionless mind. Timothy was no longer a child. He was something darker, something that had transcended the limits of childhood innocence. The power in his gaze was palpable, a force that seemed to stretch beyond the physical realm and reach into the very soul of anyone who met it. Timothy had already played his hand. The deaths, the manipulation, the control, it was all part of a much larger plan. He had orchestrated everything with such precision that there was no longer any question about who held the power. And as Dr. Harding looked at the boy before him, understood with sickening clarity that Timothy was not simply a murderer. He was a mastermind, one who had carefully crafted his own destiny, weaving together a tapestry of death, deceit, and control. The knife gleamed once more, but Dr. Harding barely noticed it now. It was the boy's voice that cut through the air, sharp and final. "You see, Dr. Harding," Timothy said softly, his voice carrying a weight that was almost hypnotic. "You've been trying to understand me this whole time. You've been trying to figure out how a child could do this, why a boy like me would choose this path." The words twisted Harding's stomach. He had spent so many sleepless nights trying to piece together the puzzle of Timothy's behavior. He had searched for answers in every corner of his mind, hoping that there was some explanation, some reason that this boy had become the way he was. But there was no reason. There was no explanation. Timothy wasn't the product of his environment. He wasn't a victim of trauma. He wasn't even a broken child who had lost his way. Timothy Caldwell was simply the embodiment of darkness itself. "You've been asking all the wrong questions," Timothy continued, his voice growing more confident, more assured with each word. "You've been trying to understand why I did what I did, but the truth is far simpler than you think." Dr. Harding's heart skipped a beat as the boy's smile twisted, a smile that was devoid of joy or warmth, but instead filled with a cold, ruthless satisfaction. "I did it because I could," Timothy said. "I did it because I had the power to do so, and because no one could stop me. No one ever will." The finality of his words hit Harding like a punch to the gut. The boy wasn't just a force of nature. He was a force that had mastered the world around him. He had learned how to manipulate, how to control, how to bend everything to his will. And now there was no going back. There was no escaping the nightmare that Timothy had created. "You think you can stop me?" Timothy continued, his eyes narrowing as he took a step closer to Harding. "But you're wrong. You never stood a chance. And with that, the realization hit Dr. Harding harder than anything else. He wasn't facing a boy anymore. He was facing an unstoppable force, a force that had already rewritten the rules. And now, the world would have to live with the consequences of Timothy Caldwell's reign. The air in the room grew heavier with each passing moment, as if the very atmosphere had been altered by the presence of Timothy Caldwell. Dr. Harding stood still, barely able to comprehend the full weight of what was unfolding before him. Timothy had already declared his victory. The boy wasn't simply a product of his environment, nor a broken child driven by some deep-rooted trauma. No, Timothy was something else entirely. He was a force of nature, a being who had mastered the art of control, of manipulation, and of life and death itself. And now, standing before Dr. Harding, Timothy's victory seemed inevitable. Harding's thoughts raced. How had it come to this? How had he failed to see the true nature of this boy? He had been so focused on understanding Timothy, on piecing together his behavior, that he had missed the most fundamental truth. Timothy wasn't just acting out of malice or revenge. He was acting out of sheer, unbridled power. The boy was in control, and there was no one left who could challenge him. Harding's mind flashed back to all the signs he had missed. The way Timothy had always been in the right place at the right time, the unnatural calmness with which he had spoken about death and suffering, the eerie detail with which he had described every tragedy. It had all been part of a plan, a grand design that no one had seen coming. You don't get it, do you? Timothy's voice broke through Harding's thoughts, calm and unyielding. This isn't about me anymore. It never was. This is about what I represent, the power to do anything, the power to shape the world around me. I am the master of my own destiny. And now, I'm going to show you just how far that power reaches. Timothy's words sent a chill through Dr. Harding, but there was something else in them too. A dark, unspoken truth that was more terrifying than any knife or weapon. It wasn't just that Timothy had killed, wasn't just that he had orchestrated deaths with unthinkable precision. It was that he had become a symbol of something much greater. Timothy had become a force of nature. He had risen above the limitations of childhood, above the boundaries of human morality. And now, there was nothing left to stop him. Harding felt the suffocating weight of the moment. There was no escape, no more clever plans, no more hope of exposing the truth. Timothy had already won. The boy wasn't just a killer. He wasn't a child who'd been corrupted by trauma or circumstance. Timothy Caldwell had become the embodiment of darkness itself, a force that could not be reasoned with, nor controlled. He was beyond human understanding. And as Dr. Harding stood there, face to face with this nightmare, he understood the terrifying truth. This was only the beginning. Timothy had learned too much. He had evolved into something that could never be stopped, and the world would never be the same again. This is the end of the line, Dr. Harding, Timothy said, his voice cold, final, and unwavering. And you'll never be able to stop it. In that moment, Dr. Harding realized the full extent of Timothy's power, not in his ability to kill, but in his ability to control. And that was what made him truly unstoppable. The silence between Dr. Harding and Timothy Caldwell felt like an eternity, stretching endlessly into the void. Harding's mind swirled with the truth he had come to accept, but couldn't fully comprehend. The power Timothy wielded wasn't just physical, it was a mental and emotional control that left no room for escape. Every moment, every action had been orchestrated by the boy with chilling precision. Dr. Harding had seen death in countless forms, But never had he encountered a mind so cold, so calculating, so utterly devoid of empathy. Timothy wasn't simply a child who had gone astray. He was a monster, shaped by the darkness he had nurtured inside himself, fed by the suffering he had caused and the control he had gained. And now, standing before him, Harding realized the full scope of the boy's vision. Timothy was no longer a mere murderer or manipulator. He was a creator of his own destiny, a force of nature that had rewired the rules of existence to fit his twisted design. Harding had failed to see this from the beginning. He had been so focused on the individual deaths, the isolated tragedies that had followed Timothy around, that he had missed the larger, more horrifying picture. This was never just about killing. This was about domination, about bending the world to his will. Do you finally understand, Dr. Harding? Timothy's voice was quiet but powerful, as if he already knew the answer. His eyes locked onto the doctor's with unrelenting force. You were never supposed to stop me. You were never supposed to understand. You were just a piece in my game. The boy's words struck Dr. Harding with the force of a hammer. A piece in the game. That was all Harding had ever been. He had been led down a path of false hope, given just enough to believe that he could expose the truth, that he could stop this madness. But it had all been part of the plan. Harding had been manipulated just like everyone else, just like all of the townspeople who had died, who had suffered. All of them pawns in Timothy's grand design. Timothy took a step forward, the knife still gleaming in his hand, but now it seemed almost insignificant. The weapon in his hand was not what made him powerful. It was his mind. It was his ability to manipulate, to control, to twist everything around him until it bent to his will. Harding wanted to run. He wanted to escape, to find a way out, to stop this nightmare from consuming everything. But it was too late. Timothy was already in control. The town was already lost. There was no turning back. You think you can stop me, but you're wrong, Timothy said softly, almost as if to himself. It's too late for that. I've already won. And with those words, Dr. Harding knew with a chilling certainty that the end had arrived. There was no hero in this story, no final confrontation that would lead to salvation. There was only Timothy Caldwell, only the boy who had turned himself into a monster. And now, the world would have to live with the consequences. As Dr. Harding stood there, the cold weight of Timothy's gaze bore down on him with suffocating intensity. The knife in the boy's hand no longer seemed like a threat. It was a symbol, a manifestation of something far more terrifying. Timothy's power didn't lie in the blade, but in his ability to control, to manipulate, to command the world around him as though it were a mere extension of his own will. And that was the most chilling part of all. Timothy had already reshaped the very fabric of the community. Each death, each tragedy, had been a calculated move, part of a grand design that no one could understand until it was too late. Every person who had died, every animal who had been tortured, was part of a plan that Dr. Harding had been unable to see until now. Doctor had been so focused on the individual pieces of the puzzle that he had missed the bigger picture. But now, it was impossible to ignore. Timothy wasn't just a child gone wrong. He was a force of nature, a creature who had transcended the boundaries of human decency and morality. His mind, sharp and calculating, had shaped the town into a twisted reflection of his own dark desires. And now, there was no one left to stop him. The town of Sedalia was already lost. Harding's mind raced, trying to grasp any shred of hope, any possibility of redemption. But there was nothing. Timothy had already won. The boy had orchestrated every move, every death, every tragedy with such precision that there was no question of turning back. Dr. Harding was no longer the hero of the story. He was just another victim caught in the web that Timothy had woven. "Do you see it now?" Timothy asked softly, his voice like a snake's hiss. "This is the world I've created. This is the world you helped me create. And now, there's no going back. The reign of terror has begun." The words echoed through Harding's mind like a death knell. It wasn't just about killing anymore. It wasn't just about the victims. It was about control. Timothy wasn't merely causing pain or suffering. He was reshaping the world around him, one step at a time, until there was nothing left but his own twisted vision. Harding's breath hitched as the full weight of Timothy's words sank in. "I've learned," Timothy continued, his voice steady, almost rehearsed. "I've learned that I don't need anyone. I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's approval. I am the master of my own destiny." Harding wanted to speak, to challenge the boy, to say something that would stop him. But there was no point. Timothy had already sealed his fate. The town was lost, the world was lost, and all that was left was the terrifying reign of Timothy Caldwell. "You see," Timothy said, almost casually now, as if he were explaining a simple concept, "the real power isn't in death. It's in knowing you control everything, knowing that nothing can stop you." Harding's blood ran cold as the realization dawned upon him. Timothy wasn't just playing a game. He was rewriting the rules. And in the end, there would be no survivors, only him. Dr. Harding's world had collapsed. Everything he had worked for, every ounce of understanding he had tried to piece together about Timothy Caldwell, had fallen apart. What he had assumed to be a series of tragic, unexplained deaths had, in reality, been the carefully calculated steps of a boy whose mind had already surpassed the capabilities of ordinary men. Timothy was no longer a child. He was a force, a dark intelligence that had no place in the world of light, of morality, or of compassion. He had transcended it all. And now, as Harding stood in the shadow of this boy, facing the chilling reality of what had been unleashed upon the world, he knew that there was no going back. Death of innocence wasn't just something that happened to victims like Mary Fletcher, Henrik Lenn, or Jacob Mills. It had happened to Timothy, a child who had once been nothing more than an orphan, displaced by war, was now the embodiment of something far more terrifying. A being who had learned to manipulate the deepest fears and darkest impulses of human nature. He had learned to control, he had learned to dominate. And now, he was going to show the world exactly what he was capable of. The boy's cold, emotionless stare fixed itself on Dr. Harding, almost as though Timothy was aware of every thought in his mind. Harding, once a man of intellect and reason, had been outmatched. This was not a child driven by emotion or retribution. This was a predator who viewed the world as nothing more than a set of variables to be controlled and manipulated. "You wanted to understand me," Timothy whispered, almost as though the words were for his own amusement. "But you didn't want to see the truth, did you, Dr. Harding? The truth is that I am beyond saving. I'm beyond help." The words cut into Harding like a blade. He had tried to understand, to rationalize, to find some explanation that could offer him a sense of hope. But there was no hope. Not for Timothy, not for the town, and not for him. The horror was only just beginning. "You've seen the pieces, Dr. Harding," Timothy continued, his tone growing softer, almost contemplative. "But you've never seen the whole picture." Now, you understand that I am the architect of everything. I am the one who controls what happens next." Harding's blood ran cold. There it was, the chilling truth. Timothy wasn't just a boy who had committed atrocities. He was an architect of destruction, of power, of manipulation. And the scariest part was that he was only beginning to understand what he could do. There would be no end to Timothy's reign. No one to challenge him, because no one would ever be able to comprehend what had happened. Not in time. Not in this lifetime. "You think you've seen the worst of me," Timothy said, almost as though he were speaking to himself now. "But this is only the beginning. This is just the start of what I'm capable of." Dr. Harding felt his legs give way beneath him. His mind was overwhelmed, his body drained of strength. There was no escape. There never had been. Timothy had already won, and the world would never be the same again. What had started with the deaths of a few had now grown into something far larger, far more terrifying. The end of innocence had come, and the reign of terror had only just begun. Timothy's presence was now an overwhelming force, suffocating everything around him. There was no room for doubt, no place for escape. Dr. Harding, despite his years of medical training and scientific expertise, had no answers. The boy before him was not the product of nature or nurture. Timothy Caldwell was a force, a harbinger of a new kind of power, one that could not be contained or reasoned with. Harding had spent years trying to understand death, disease, human nature itself, but this was beyond comprehension. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The town of Sedalia, once a quiet farming community, was now a mere reflection of what it had been. The faces of the people Harding had known and respected were now mere specters, lost in the wake of Timothy's manipulation and terror. The town was infected by the boy's presence, twisted by the same chilling influence that had driven him to orchestrate death and destruction with such precision. There was no chance for redemption. There was no hero in this story. There was only Timothy. The boy had become the master of his world, bending it to his will, taking control in ways that no one could have foreseen. His eyes locked onto Harding's, the coldness in them now more pronounced than ever. There was nothing left of the child Harding had once thought he could understand. All that remained was this creature, this force who had learned to control, to manipulate, to bend life and death itself. "You've seen enough now, haven't you?" Timothy's voice was almost soft, a quiet murmur that held more power than any shout could. Harding tried to speak, tried to form a thought, but the words caught in his throat. He had no more fight left in him. He had failed, and Timothy knew it. The boy didn't need to say it. Harding could see it in his eyes. "You think you're the first one to try and stop me." Timothy continued, his tone mocking but calm. "But you're not, and you won't be the last." Harding's body trembled, not just from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what Timothy had accomplished. He had taken control, and now there was no one left to stop him. The rest of the world would soon follow. "I've already won," Timothy said, his smile twisted and chilling. "You were never a part of the plan. You were just another pawn, another person who couldn't see the bigger picture." The world seemed to collapse in on Harding in that moment, as the weight of Timothy's words pressed down on him with suffocating finality. There was no going back. There was no more hope. Timothy had done what no one thought possible. He had gained the ultimate power. And now, there would be no end to his reign. The town would fall. The world would fall. And Timothy Caldwell would remain, a dark force that no one could stop, a child whose power could not be contained, not by any means. He was beyond human reach. He was beyond death. The boy had become the nightmare that would never end. Harding could feel the weight of Timothy's words settle in like a shroud, suffocating him with the overwhelming realization that there was no way out. The world, the town, had already been reshaped, twisted into something unrecognizable under the boy's hand. What had started as a quiet farming community had now become a hollow shell, a reflection of what Timothy had made it. The silence was deafening as Harding stood face to face with the boy, his pulse racing, his body trembling from the weight of the inevitable truth. There was no stopping this. There was no force on earth capable of halting Timothy Caldwell now. The boy's smile, cold and unyielding, held no trace of innocence, no flicker of the child he once was. In its place was something far darker. A creature of intellect and calculation, a predator who had learned how to manipulate every person, every circumstance, every tragedy to fit his design. "You think you can stop me, but you're wrong," Timothy said, his voice a soft whisper that carried the power of 1,000 storms. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement. Harding swallowed hard, his throat dry, as he fought the overwhelming urge to run, to escape. But there was no escape. Not from Timothy. Not from the nightmare that had already consumed everything. This is what happens when someone like me gets everything they want. Timothy continued, his voice eerily calm. This is the power I've earned. The power to shape everything around me. No one can stop me. No one ever will. Harding's mind raced, but there was no clear path, no way forward. All the pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and there was only one truth left. Timothy had become the ultimate force. The boy who had once been an orphan, cast aside by war and loss, had transformed into something unstoppable. Something beyond comprehension, something that would continue to shape the world in his image. "You see, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his gaze unwavering, "it's not just about death anymore. It's about power. It's about control. I've learned how to manipulate everything, how to make people believe they're in control when, in reality, they're already mine. Every person, every event, every tragedy. It was all part of my plan, and now you understand." Harding's chest tightened as the boy's words pierced through him. He had failed to see it. He had failed to understand what Timothy had become. It wasn't just about killing anymore. It was about domination, and Timothy had already achieved it. "You think you can stop me," Timothy repeated, almost mockingly. "But you can't. You're just another part of the game. You're just another piece to be moved, to be manipulated." The cold realization hit Harding like a blow to the gut. He was no longer in control of this situation. He had never been. Timothy had already won. There was nothing left to do but watch as the world continued to fall apart, piece by piece, under the boy's unrelenting control. The town was lost, world would be lost, and Timothy Caldwell would reign supreme, untouched, unstoppable, and unchallenged. The crushing weight of Timothy's words settled into Dr. Harding's chest like a stone. There was no escape from this reality. Timothy had not only orchestrated death, but he had reshaped the world, twisted it into a version that served his every whim. The boy had no sense of empathy, no moral compass. He had transcended humanity's limitations, becoming a force that no one, not even Dr. Harding, could control. Timothy was beyond understanding, beyond salvation. The doctor's pulse quickened, his body cold with the realization that all his efforts had been in vain. Every question, every theory he had concocted in an attempt to understand this child had been irrelevant. In the end, Timothy had always been steps ahead. Harding had been nothing more than a participant in the boy's grand design, a piece of the game he had been unknowingly playing. "Do you feel it, Dr. Harding?" Timothy asked, his voice almost casual, but laced with an unmistakable venom. The weight of inevitability, the crushing reality that you can't stop this, you can't stop me. Harding stood frozen, his heart pounding in his ears. He had no words. There was nothing left to say. The boy's victory was complete, and there was no one left who could challenge him. This was no longer a battle of wills. This was a war that Timothy had already won. And as the doctor stood there, facing the boy who had destroyed everything he once knew, understood the depth of the horror that had been unleashed upon the world. Timothy's smile grew ever so slightly, an expression that seemed to say it all. He knew. He knew what Harding was thinking. He knew the doctor had finally come to terms with the reality of the situation. There was no fight left in him. There was no resistance. There was only acceptance. "This is the moment where it all comes together, Dr. Harding," Timothy whispered, his voice almost a purr. "The world will never be the same. I have shaped it in my image, and nothing will stop me now." The knife in Timothy's hand glinted in the dim light, but it wasn't the weapon that held power anymore. It was the boy's mind. The knife was just a symbol, a tool. Timothy's true strength lay in his ability to control, to manipulate, to bend the world around him until it fit his twisted desires. Dr. Harding's knees began to shake, his strength fading as the realization of the boy's full power took hold. The town was already lost, and so was he. There was no redemption, no heroism left in this story. There was only Timothy, and the nightmare he had crafted. Harding wanted to fight, to try and stop the boy, but the truth was undeniable. He had already lost. Timothy had already won. And in the end, all dark, Harding could do was watch as the boy's reign of terror continued to unfold, unchallenged, unstoppable, and eternal. The world would never recover from this. The air felt heavy with an unspoken understanding, as if the world had already bent to the will of Timothy Caldwell. Dr. Harding, standing there, a broken figure in the presence of a force far beyond his comprehension, could no longer deny the truth. Timothy had become the embodiment of something that could not be undone, a force of nature that had reshaped reality itself. And now, the doctor was witnessing the horrifying reality of what that meant. Timothy was not just a boy. He was the apex of an evolution that no one had predicted. A child who had transcended the limitations of humanity, whose mind was a labyrinth of cold logic and manipulation. Every step he had taken, every life he had destroyed, had been part of a grand design. And now, standing in the wreckage of the world Timothy had built, Harding could only see one undeniable truth: that it was over. There was no going back. The town of Sedalia, once a place of life and growth, had been reduced to a shell of itself. The people who once lived there were now mere memories, casualties of the boy who had taken control. The animals, the children, the families who had been affected, they were all part of a larger game. And now, the game was done. Timothy's reign had begun. "You see," Timothy said, his voice low and controlled, as if speaking to himself, "this is what happens when someone like me decides to take control. There are no more accidents. There are no more mysteries. There is only power. There is only what I want." Dr. Harding's heart raced, but his mind was numb, frozen by the inevitability of it all. There was no fighting this, no resisting it. Timothy had already won, and you were a part of it all. Timothy continued, his voice cold, almost detached. You were just a small piece in my game. A pawn to help me understand how far I could push, how much I could control. Harding's chest tightened, the weight of those words crushing him. He had thought he could save the town. He had thought he could stop the boy. But he had failed. The doctor had never truly understood the depth of the darkness he was up against. He had never seen what Timothy had become. The boy wasn't just a killer, a manipulator, or a monster. Timothy Caldwell was the embodiment of power itself. A power that had been nurtured and refined until it could no longer be ignored. And now, that power was irreversible. The town is mine. Timothy whispered, his voice full of a chilling satisfaction. Everything is mine, and there's nothing anyone can do to change that. As those words echoed through Harding's mind, the last shred of hope left him. The boy was no longer a child. He was something else. Something far more terrifying. And the world would have to live with the legacy of Timothy Caldwell. Legacy built on death, control, and power. A legacy that no one could escape. The darkness of Timothy Caldwell's reign settled over the town like a thick fog, suffocating everything in its path. Sedalia, once a quiet farming community, had been utterly transformed. The vibrant life that once filled the streets, the laughter of children playing in the fields, the hum of industry and work. All of it had vanished. In its place was a cold, lifeless shell, the mark of Timothy's hand upon it. There was no escaping it. No matter where you went, no matter how far you ran, the shadow of Timothy Caldwell would follow. Harding, standing on the precipice of everything he had failed to prevent, now understood the full extent of what had transpired. The boy had become something far worse than anyone could have imagined, a force not just of destruction, but of domination. Timothy had learned to control everything. He had learned how to manipulate fear, how to bend others to his will with nothing more than his presence, his words, and his chilling understanding of the human psyche. It wasn't just about death anymore. It wasn't even about pain. It was about power. Absolute power, and the ability to shape everything around him to fit his dark vision. The deaths, the disappearances, the endless string of tragedies. All of it had been part of a carefully constructed plan, a game in which Timothy had been the master from the very beginning. And now, as the dust settled and the world Harding had known was irrevocably altered, the boy stood as the last figure of authority in this twisted new world. You see, Dr. Harding. Timothy's voice broke through the doctor's thoughts, chillingly calm. It's not just about what I've done. It's about what I've learned. I've learned that I can make people believe anything. I can make them do anything. And once I have that, I can control everything. Harding's breath caught in his throat. The realization that the boy had never truly been in danger, never truly lost control, was a bitter pill to swallow. Timothy hadn't been driven by instinct or chaos. He had been driven by something far more methodical. A cold, calculating mind that had planned every moment with terrifying precision. And now, standing in the wreckage of everything, Harding understood that there was no turning back. There was no coming from this. Timothy had already sealed the fate of the world around him. I don't need to explain myself anymore. Timothy continued, his voice still soft but carrying the weight of finality. You've seen what I can do. You've seen what I've become. And now you'll see what happens when someone like me gets everything they want. The boy's smile, so small yet so terrifying, spread across his face. It was a smile that conveyed nothing but satisfaction. satisfaction in knowing that he had already won. The town was his. The world was his, and there was no one left who could stand against him. Dr. Harding had fought for truth, for understanding, for some form of redemption. But in the end, none of it mattered. The world had fallen, and Timothy Caldwell's legacy would continue, an eternal shadow that no one could escape. Dr. Harding stood motionless, as if trapped in a nightmare from which there was no awakening. The world around him had crumbled, not in a single violent eruption, but slowly, methodically, until it had been reshaped entirely by the cold hand of Timothy Caldwell. The boy who had once been a child orphaned by war was no longer a mere figure of tragedy. He had evolved into something far more dangerous, an unstoppable force of nature, one that had bent the world to his will. Harding's heart thudded in his chest as he absorbed the full weight of his failure. He had been a man of science, of reason, trained to find explanations for the inexplicable. But Timothy was beyond explanation. He wasn't a product of a broken world or a tragic upbringing. He was the embodiment of a darker force, one that had always existed, lying dormant, until it had found the perfect vessel to awaken. Timothy's power had always been in his mind, his ability to control, to manipulate, to see the world as nothing more than a game, and everyone in it as a mere pawn. And now, the doctor was standing in the aftermath, a witness to the final realization that this child had done what no one could have imagined. He had conquered. He had broken the world. And there would be no return. You think you're the only one who understands, don't you, Dr. Harding? Timothy's voice broke through Harding's thoughts, cold and mocking. But you're wrong. You're just another part of the experiment. Harding's body felt numb as he stood there, listening to the boy's words. The world around him seemed to blur, the realization settling deep within his bones. Timothy hadn't just controlled the town, the people, the deaths. He had controlled Dr. Harding, too. He had manipulated the doctor's every move, every instinct, drawing him into the web without him even realizing it. The boy had studied Harding like an object of research, just as he had studied the animals, the people, the world around him. There had been no chance from the beginning. You've seen the consequences, haven't you? Timothy continued, his voice growing darker, more commanding. You've seen what happens when someone like me is allowed to control everything. It's not about survival anymore. It's not about being right or wrong. It's about power, and I have it all. Harding's chest tightened. The boy's words hung in the air, reverberating in his mind. There was no escaping this reality. There never had been. Timothy had already won. The town was lost. The world was lost. And there was no one left who could challenge him. There's nothing left for you to do now, Timothy said, his eyes locking onto Harding's with the cold certainty of a predator. You've seen the truth, but it doesn't matter. You're just another piece, another part of the game. And now, the game is over. Dr. Harding's breath came in shallow gasps. The weight of the boy's words crushed him, suffocating him in the realization that everything he had fought for, everything he had believed in, had been nothing more than a fleeting illusion. The reign of Timothy Caldwell had already begun, and there was no end in sight. The room seemed to close in on Dr. Harding as Timothy's final words hung in the air, heavier than any blade. The boy had already won. The darkness that had once been a quiet whisper in the town had now consumed everything, and there was no one left to stop it. Timothy Caldwell was no longer just a child or a monster. He had become the very embodiment of power, a force that reshaped the world in his image. Harding's mind raced, grasping for some final thread of hope, some way to fix what had been broken. But the truth was undeniable. There was nothing left. The town had fallen, the people had died, and the world was now Timothy's to command. "You don't get it, do you?" Timothy's voice was soft, but each word was like a hammer strike against Harding's fading resolve. "You thought there was a way out, didn't you? You thought that if you figured it out, if you understood me, you could stop me. But you never could." The finality in the boy's voice rang in Harding's ears like a death knell. There was no more room for questions, no more theories to test. Timothy was untouchable. The world was his. "It's over, Dr. Harding." Timothy continued, his eyes piercing the doctor's soul. "You're the last one standing, the last one to realize that I am in control. Everything else has already fallen into place. Every piece has been moved." Harding felt the cold grip of helplessness tightening around his chest. Every part of him screamed to do something, anything, to stop this nightmare. But in his heart, he knew it was pointless. Timothy had thought of everything. He had manipulated every outcome, every moment, with a precision that left nothing to chance. The boy had already turned the key, set the pieces in motion, and now there was no stopping it. The reign of Timothy Caldwell was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a dark reality that stretched far beyond the town, a force that would ripple outward, destroying everything in its path. "You were never part of the plan," Timothy said, his tone as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "You were just a distraction, a way to test the waters. And now you've seen it for yourself. You've seen what happens when someone like me takes control." Harding's breath faltered as the full weight of Timothy's words struck him. This wasn't just about control over the town, it was about the future. Timothy wasn't done. He wasn't finished. And in that moment, Harding realized the horrifying truth. The boy's reign would not end here. This was only the beginning. "The world will be mine, Dr. Harding," Timothy said, his eyes gleaming with cold satisfaction. "And there's nothing anyone can do to stop me." The words rang in the doctor's ears as the last traces of hope evaporated. There was no redemption, no hero, no escape. There was only Timothy, and the legacy he would leave behind would be one of unrelenting darkness, a shadow that would stretch far beyond Sedalia, beyond the boundaries of time itself. The game was over. The boy had already won.